privilege to welcome all of you for the launch of a report on a green and sustainable growth agenda for the global economy. This report is a compilation of ideas and insights drawn from discussions held during the International Policy Conference organized by NITI Aayog in partnership with the International Development Research Center, IDRC, and the Global Development Network on 28th and 29th of July 2023. First and foremost, I would like to welcome our guest of honor for today's event, Shri Bhupender Yadav, Honorable Minister for Environment, Forests and Climate Change and Labour and Employment. Other esteemed dignitaries joining us for the launch of the report and the participation in the technical session to follow include Honorable Vice Chairman NITI Aayog Shri Amitabh, India's G20 Sherpa Shri Amitabh Kant, the Brazilian Ambassador to India, His Excellency Kenneth Nobrega, CEO NITI Aayog Shri BVR Subramaniam, Secretary Department of Economic Affairs Shri Ajay Seth, Shri Kapil Kapoor, Regional Director for Asia, International Development Research Center. I would like to extend a special welcome to honorable members of NITI Aayog, Dr. Ramesh Chand and Dr. Arvind Virmani, distinguished colleagues from ministries, embassies, multilateral organizations and think tanks, as well as my colleagues from NITI Aayog who have joined us here today. Leaders of the G20 member nations convened in New Delhi on 9th and 10th of September 2023 to issue the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration with unanimous consensus. They committed to a series of actions and goals in the declaration under the theme Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which translates to One Earth, One Family, One Future. This momentous event took place under the Indian presidency, with the world's leading and emerging economies coming together to form new alliances for ensuring a better future for all. The International Policy Conference, organized by NITI Aayog in July 2023, was an official side event designed to explore the contours of a new development model to guide future G20 presidencies. Today, with the launch of the report, we aim to offer a body of knowledge on this subject and hope to provide valuable inputs for Brazil as it takes over the presidency from India. Without further delay, I would now like to invite our esteemed guest of honor, Shri Bhupender Yadav, to the dais, alongside Honorable Vice Chairman NITI Aayog Shri Suman Beri, India's G20 Sherpa Shri Amitabh Kant, CEO NITI Aayog Shri BVR Subramaniam, Secretary Department of Economic Affairs Shri Ajay Seth, and Shri Kapil Kapoor, Regional Director for Asia IDRC. We will commence today's event with the context-setting address by Shri Suman Beri. I would request you, sir, to please deliver your address. Thank you.
Shri Bhupender Yadav, Honorable Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change and Labour and Employment, Government of India, the Honorable Ambassador of Brazil to India, who is in the audience, my esteemed colleague, CEO NITI Aayog, Shri BVR Subramaniam, the G20 Sherpa, Shri Amitabh Kant, Secretary Economic Affairs, Ajay Seth, Kapil Kapoor from IDRC, respected members of NITI Aayog, friends in the audience from a number of communities. Thank you all for joining us for this important event. The program is in two parts. There is a launch of the volume, for which we are extremely honored to have the Honorable Minister for Environment, Forest, Climate Change and employment, as will become clear in some of my remarks and later on when we get to the technical session. He holds important portfolios of what was discussed at the conference in July, namely climate change, as well as the future of work in the face of technological change. And of course, he is just back from COP28 in Dubai, and perhaps he'll speak a little bit to that. Thank you, Minister, very much for sparing your valuable time. So, in my context setting, I wanted to indicate both why we held this particular side event, and we were very grateful to the Sherpa Amitabh Kant for the strong support he gave. Of course, he is a friend and ally of NITI Aayog, having shaped the NITI Aayog of today in so many ways. And then also why, over and above the conference, I thought it was worth having this launch event. So, Sherpa, and indeed even the Honourable Minister, know that that the business of crafting communiques in international negotiations is a game of inches and not yards or miles, which is to say, each word is debated, and each decision has to be carefully, the wording of each decision has to be carefully weighed. But, and I can't say that the idea was original with me, on a visit to Canada a couple of years ago, I happened to talk to somebody who had been a partner with India in something called the Framework Working Group under the finance track, which of course would be well known to Secretary of Economic Affairs, and indeed Chief Economic Advisor, I believe, is India's representative on the Framework Working Group. And this gentleman, who was actually at our conference, Paul Sampson, made a point that stuck with me, not that I was in NITI Aayog at that time. He said, look, the fact of the matter is, and this was when COVID was still abroad, that the world is searching for a new development model. And when the G20 presidency comes to India, over and above the T20, the B20, all of the other fora that exist to support the G20, why don't you, as a think tanker, which is what I was at that time, try and convene an international discussion on the longer term challenges facing the world and what they actually mean for a new growth paradigm. At that time, COVID was still, as I say, active. The war in Ukraine had not yet happened, but India was privileged in actually being able to convene the first full face-to-face meeting of the G20. And so after testing the idea with Sherpa, who gave me very strong encouragement, NITI decided to proceed with that idea. And what we had was an international conference. Sherpa again suggested that we have this conference before the summit, and I hope that he gave a lot of his time, and I hope that some of the ideas that emerged from it were of help to him. So the hope is that today, in the launch and the discussion following the launch, we will step back a little bit to think not only of what we now know, the New Delhi's Leaders' Declaration, what that means for, as it were, the shape of the world's future trajectory, and there was a lot that was achieved. but also what all of this might actually mean for India's own efforts at becoming Viksit Bharat at 2047. As I've said on various occasions, including at the meeting of our Governing Council, India's rise is both going to be shaped by a global order and will shape a global order. I mean, we are the same size of economy now, at least at market prices, forget PPP, as, say, the UK. And the fact of the matter is that the UK considers it to be its business to think about global governance. And I think from that point of view, our G20 presidency was very much if you like, a coming out party, an expression of India's realization that even though it considers itself a middle power, it has responsibilities, particularly to the global south, to at least shape the conversation. And so this meeting at this time, which was timed so that Sherpa could be here, he has just returned from Brazil, is partly to continue the discussion. Hon'ble PM has asked us to do that, but also in some ways as a kind of rite of passage to the Brazilian presidency, and I'm very pleased that representing Brazil, we do have the ambassador for the technical session. So that's why I'm very grateful to all of those who have come. Also grateful, of course, to the team at NITI Aayog that have pulled this together. And so I will return to our MC and my colleague Urvashi to guide us through the remainder of the launch session. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Urvashi, back to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very helpful context setting. We will now have a short video message from Professor Jean-Louis Arcon, who could not be with us here today. He's the president of the Global Development Network, which also partnered with NITI for organizing this conference in July.
Hi, I'm Jean-Louis Arcon, and I'm the president of the Global Development Network, a public international organization that supports high-quality, policy-oriented social science research in low and middle-income countries in the Global South. And we do so by supporting researchers in the Global South, and we strengthen their research capacity. We do this in various manners, through grants, through networking and collaboration, through mentorship programs, and by assessing in a holistic manner Southern research systems. We have been heavily involved in various SDG-related research programs. In particular, this year, we've been focusing on biodiversity and development. And this was the focus of our annual conference, which has been taking place on an annual basis since 1999. And this year, it was held in Quito, Ecuador, on the topic of biodiversity and sustainable development. And while GDN is largely focused on the social sciences, we believe that the plethora of crises, climate, economic, food security, environment, cannot be ignored and need to be dealt with in a holistic manner. Now, the G20 conference on Green and Sustainable Growth Agenda, which was held in New Delhi in July of 2023, was the result of a tripartite collaboration between NITI Aayog, IDRC, and GDN. And it gathered leading global experts. Suman Berry referred to this very kindly as very memorably actually, as the WISE 40, to weigh in on climate and environmental issues and share insights on various aspects of green and sustainable growth. The subject matter of the conference included green development, climate finance, accelerated, inclusive, and resilient growth, accelerating progress towards the SDGs, and last but not least, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. The report that is being launched today in the context of the Indian presidency of the G20 contains the proceedings and outcomes of this event, and I think a very digestible manner. And all of these are of relevance to current global priorities in the development agenda. The objective was to basically tap into thought leadership from this group of 40 eminent academics and policymakers, and the report is the outcome of that. I am really sorry not to be with you in person and to only be able to address you through video, but I'm sure that all participants will enjoy reading this report, and it will be of interest to policymakers, scholars, and anyone interested in achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
I would now like to request our guest of honor, the Honorable Minister Shri Bhupender Yadav, for his address, please.
Just wanted to again thank the Minister for being here, and to introduce him particularly to those of you who may be from overseas. Bhupender Yadav has been a seasoned lawyer of the Supreme Court of India, is a member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha representing Rajasthan for almost a decade, and assumed charge as Union Cabinet Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in July 21, and additionally holds the charge, as I've already mentioned, of the Ministry of Labour and Employment. Under the charismatic leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and with Mr. Yadav's effective organizational skills, the BJP secured a historic victory in the form of an overwhelming majority in state assembly elections across multiple states, including in the general elections for Parliament in 2019. As Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Mr. Yadav has taken up issues of a significant nature, not only from India's perspective, but from the point of view of all developing country, and has used the international platforms of COP26 in Glasgow, 27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and most recently COP28 at the UAE, in addition to G20 environment ministers meetings in Bali and Chennai. A conservationist at heart, Mr. Yadav is a prolific writer and was the co-author of the book Supreme Court on Forest Conversation, and his latest book, The Rise of the BJP, has been a consistent bestseller. Thank you, Minister, and we eagerly await your remarks.
Shri Amitabh ji, Shri Amitabh Kant ji, Shri Subramanian ji, dignitaries on dais, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I thanks to the NITI Aayog for publish this report for a green and sustainable growth agenda. This is the important issue where world is moving on. As we know, the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration arrived in September this year, reflects India's success in imparting a new purpose and momentum to a group that has been in danger of irrelevance. The consensus arrived at carries a commitment to deliver a strong, sustainable and inclusive growth. What makes the New Delhi Declaration even more significant is that it has come at a time when sustainable development goals are facing stagnation in the face of multiple crises. We are all aware that only 12% of SDGs are currently on track. When we speak about the challenges of SDGs, the global economic downturn, violent conflicts, biodiversity loss, degradation of water, drylands, forests, and climate change rank high. It cannot be emphasized enough that poverty anywhere is a threat to peace and prosperity everywhere. Global cooperation is thus an imperative for global good. India's success in achieving the 100% consensus at G20 has therefore set an example that the world can learn from. I congratulate NITI Aayog for putting together this publication on a green and sustainable agenda for the global economy, which will add to the body of knowledge on the subject. It will also provide valuable inputs for Brazil as it take over the G20 presidency from India. Ladies and gentlemen, I returned from Dubai last week after attending the 28th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the world agreed to initiate urgent climate action based on national circumstances. Through its G20 presidency steered by Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji, India had put forth the resolve to make climate action a collaborative process based on common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. I am happy to share with you here today that India's voice was not only be heard but also significantly included in the UA declaration. The operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund is an example of India's success in emerging as an impactful voice of the Global South. The United Nations Climate Change Conference closed at an agreement that signals the transitioning to renewable energy sources by laying the ground for a swift, just and equitable transition underpinned by deep emissions cuts and scaled up finance. India has maintained that climate finance and technology are essential to meet the aspirations of Global South. The countries of Global South, which have had little to no contribution to the climate crisis, accept the developed countries to help them combat climate change. India maintains this in both natural and justified. The G20 New Delhi Declaration agreed that climate action requires several $1 trillion to climate finance by 2030. At COP28, Honorable PM Shri Narendra Modi ji said that the developed world must ensure a steady flow of climate finance that is available, accessible, and affordable. The UAE declaration to highlighted the growing gap between the needs of developing countries and the support provided and mobilized for their efforts to implement their nationally determined contributions, highlighting that such needs are currently estimated at 5.8 to 5.9 trillions for the period pre-2030 period. The COP28 declaration also says that developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries with respect to both mitigation and adaptation in continuation of their existing obligation, and that other countries are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. The document highlights that financial pledges are far short of what is needed to support developing countries with clean energy transitions, implementing the national climate plans and adaptation efforts. It underscores that the time to turn pledges into real economy outcome is now. In order to deliver such funding, the UAE declaration underscores the importance of reforming the multilateral financial architecture and accelerating the ongoing establishment of new and innovative source of finance. To fight climate change, developing countries need technological innovation, accessibility, capacity building, and awareness. But awareness of technology alone will not be sufficient to address the issue of sustainability. Awareness must also in the form of environmental consciousness. PM Modi's clarion call for environmentally friendly lifestyle, which has taken the form of Mission Life, is about creating awareness of action. Mission Life nudges us to aware the environmental impact of our actions. All we need to do join Mission Life is to always be mindful of whether our action will nurture the environment or cause its destruction. Just like we have civic sense, we need to inculcate environmental sense. A habit that causes inconvenience to others is bad civic sense. An action that pollutes the environment lacks environmental sense. India is among the 26 countries to have shared its national communication with the UNFCCC based on greenhouse gas inventory of 2019 with initial adaptation communication. I take pride in sharing with you that under the leadership of Shri Narendra Modi ji, despite being a developing country, India is not only taking the lead in climate action, but we are also leading the philosophical action needed to heal planet Earth and restore environmental balance. India's commitment to following a lifestyle based on sustainable practices is evidenced from the fact that our per capita carbon footprint is 60% lower than the global average, a manifestation of the principle that drives Mission Life. We are reaching out to children and youth of the country for environmental sensitization because we cannot save nature without understanding that nature is not any different from us. It is a part of a whole. Even we negotiate the terms of agreement on global temperature rise, biodiversity restoration, arresting soil erosion, we need to understand that real purpose of saving planet Earth. It is not only because Earth is the only home we have. The approach drives us to believe that nature exists only for human gratification. This approach is a real reason we are in the current crisis. The planet belongs to birds, the rivers, the mountains, the wildlife, as much as it belongs to us. We are intricately linked and therefore our interests cannot be at variance. This is the environmental consciousness we need to inculcate in climate action towards building a happier, healthier, and sustainable planet. While consciousness has been difficult to come over the year, the world has worked with a positive attitude to find solutions. India's G20 presidency has been historic in building consensus on some of the most complex issues. What we need now is for the consensus to translate into concrete action. I believe in the power of human resilience to rise up to the occasion we need it. History offers hope for humanity. We have in the past overcome divides in the interest of greater common good. There is no reason we will not do it again. The publication offers lessons and hope for a better world. I once again congratulate NITI Aayog for steering this effort. To everyone present here today, I extend my heartfelt gratitude for having me and listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our guest of honor for his very insightful remarks. Before I request the dignitaries on stage to officially launch the report, I would request for a short clip to be played as the digital release of the publication. I would now request our guest of honor and other dignitaries present on stage to kindly release the report. With this, we come to the conclusion of the first session of this program. I would like to invite CEO NITI Aayog, Shri B.V.R. Subramaniam, for his vote of thanks, post which we will begin the technical session after the departure of the guest of honor.
Respected Minister Bhupender Yadav ji, on behalf of NITI Aayog, the Vice Chairman in particular, we'd like to thank you for taking time off to come here and release this publication. We are aware that you're extremely busy. There's a Parliament session on, and in spite of that, you managed to pull time out and come here. I think your words were very forward-looking, soothing, and give us hope that there is hope for the world, there's hope for India. And I think everybody in the room who's here, who's associated with this large area of sustainable and green growth, they will certainly be inspired by your words, by the leadership of the Prime Minister and the leadership which you have shown at COP28. I also thank all the dignitaries on the dais for being with us here today. I'm hopeful that they'll be continuing for the next session, which is the technical session. We'll break for a minute. The Minister would leave, but we'll continue with the technical session. Thank you.
So we'll just begin the technical session. The Brazilian ambassador will join us shortly. But we're beginning with a short overview of this publication of the report. Mr. Berry has already set the context for this conference, and really the objective was to undertake a deep dive on the prospects and challenges pertaining to green and sustainable growth for the global economy. So it was truly a global conference because we had speakers and experts representing nearly 15 countries across the world. The global backdrop for this conference, and indeed the presidency, was as following. It was characterized by opinions being sharply divided on growth consequences of the energy transition, especially in light of the adaptive challenge of climate change. International agencies like the IMF and the WTO have warned of economic welfare consequences of the balkanization of international trade in the pursuit of economic security. There's also increasing concern that the global finance system is not a force supporting long-term sustainable growth, and that liberal globalization, whether rightly or wrongly in the minds of the public, is associated with rising inequality, at least within nations. So we had 6 major themes for the conference, and here I've briefly set out why they were important and why we chose them. The first one is on energy, climate, and growth, where we discussed a range of issues, including global cooperation and climate economics, India's specific challenges and opportunities in the transition, trade-offs in the political economy of climate action, and viewing climate adaptation as an economic problem. In the second session, which was on technology, policy, and jobs, the experts deliberated on major job market transformations, demographic concerns such as an aging global population, increased environmentally driven migration, as well as advances in generative AI. The third theme was around the growth implications of a fractured trading system, where the experts discussed China's resilience and dominance, as well as the impact of deglobalization on Europe and the US-China relations. The fourth theme was on reshaping global finance for sustainable growth, where a range of issues were touched upon, most importantly, increasing global financing needs in face of dwindling liquidity, as well as the inadequacy of the currently informal, inefficient, and fragmented global financial architecture. The fifth theme was an extremely important one relating to multilateralism and geopolitics and governance and the global commons, where the experts spoke about strained multilateralism and how it is triggering a shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world, as well as systemic crises stemming from disruptive technological innovations and lasting impacts of the COVID pandemic. Severe recessions transmitted from the global north to the global south through trade channels were also discussed extensively. And the final sixth theme was adjustment, resilience, and inclusion in an uncertain world, where various challenges that impede efforts towards full inclusion and equitable growth were discussed, as well as the desirability of developing an inclusion norm based on health, nutrition, and overall well-being. I will briefly go through the key takeaways from each of these themes and sessions. The details are of course in the publication. On the first session, there were two major takeaways. One was that multilateralism is a necessity, not an option, and flexibility is central to the global south as it deals with the disproportionate impacts of climate change. The second theme on technology, policy, and jobs. There were several recommendations with respect to investing in education, stimulating the labor force by increasing the retirement age, sustainability being as much about human well-being as about an economic activity, and the need to restructure international cooperation to tackle shared challenges. In the third theme on the growth implications of a fractured trading system, it emerged that India has the possibility of emerging as a future engine of growth, especially given the aging population in China. And there was also much debate about the adoption of innovative strategies centered on sustainable growth and the need for trade reform. The fourth theme on reshaping global finance for sustainable growth had several takeaways, such as making the allocation of special drawing rights rule-based and less discretionary, managing debt sustainably and transparently, strengthening financial safety nets, and regulating the role of credit rating agencies. On multilateralism, the experts highlighted the need to advocate for more manageable, tangible goals within the SDG framework, as well as overhauling of multilateral institutions and encouraging the growth of minilaterals. An insurance mechanism for the global south against shocks to the global north was also emphasized. The final theme focused on the design of social protection systems by growing middle-income countries to minimize problems associated with coverage expansion, as well as addressing multidimensional poverty by considering aspects beyond income, such as health and nutrition. In the last three slides, I will quickly summarize these key recommendations or takeaways, or distill them rather, in terms of implications for the global south, for India, as well as for the G20. So for the global south, as I mentioned earlier, there was a clear recommendation that setting up a flexibility mission could be very helpful in coping with the disproportionate impacts of climate change. There was also an opportunity for the global south to expand its global footprint by leveraging opportunities presented by ongoing decoupling and restructuring of supply chains of global corporations on a China plus one basis. And finally, as I touched upon on the earlier slide, developing effective insurance mechanisms against the severe recessions transmitted from the global north to the global south. The next slide is on implications for India, and there were several implications, many of which NITI will also take forward in its work, but I'm just highlighting some of the key ones here. One was that there can be, and this does need to be explored further, potentially positive impact of India's transition to net zero emissions, which involves a shift away from fossil fuel imports. Enhancing productivity in traditional sectors was stressed upon, creating manufacturing jobs, managing competitive exchange rates, as well as closing the infrastructure and logistics gap. We had an extensive discussion on the Gati Shakti master plan in this context, as well as improving education and skills development. We also had a keynote address during the conference from Mr. Nandan Nilikani, who highlighted India's digital public infrastructure and how it can play a crucial role in climate change action, aiding in anticipatory climate financing, the promotion of a circular economy, and creation of energy interfaces. And this is my final slide, which is to distill some of the recommendations and the takeaways for the G20. 4 tenets of the new multilateralism emerged. One was that meeting global challenges requires substantially higher public and private investment in developing countries, that most developing countries will need considerable international support given the limited financial, technical and technological capacity, that multilateral development banks are the best positioned institutions to deliver this support at scale and with urgency, and that MDBs themselves need to transform before helping countries transform the world. We also had suggestions of increasing representation of the Global South in the G20 by inviting minilaterals like the ASEAN as observers. Of course, we spoke a lot about the multi-pronged reforms which were needed, fairer credit ratings, the need for perhaps a non-proliferation treaty for the SDGs. There was a focus on inclusion and why Africa is so important. And of course, the Indian presidency made significant advances in this direction with the inclusion of the African Union. And finally, how the G20 might find trade-offs between efficiency and security to not lead to discretionary prohibitions. So with this, we will move on to the discussion, the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Mr. Suman Berry. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Urvashi. So we are amazingly exactly on time, and we have an hour. I'm very delighted by the turnout. Let me first acknowledge the arrival of member V.K. Paul, and both Mr. Paul and Dr. Paul and Dr. Chand were actually at the conference and made contributions, which I included, I believe, in the volume. There are others also here in the audience who were on the program. I see Manjeev, I see Arnabha. I have to give apologies for the CEO who has been called away. But my proposal would be that we make the first stage interactive and call in the following order the people who are on the stage. Firstly, our Sherpa, who has just returned from Brazil. Second, the Brazilian ambassador as the current holder of the G20 presidency. Then Kapil Kapoor, who has not only supported this conference, but has very much a sense of the intellectual agenda, both in Asia and more broadly, as also because of his long association with Africa, on what the induction of the Africa Union means. So if we are able to get those observations out, perhaps I could moderate a discussion on the podium and then throw it open to the audience for Q&A before closing at 4. So with that, Amitabh, again, gratitude for the wholehearted support that you gave this venture. You're back now as part of the Troika process from, was it Brasilia? Where did you go? Oh, yeah, to Brasilia. So before we invite the Brazilian ambassador, just, when the conference took place, there was a lot of suspense. You have on, whether we would achieve consensus. I think both India's success at the G20 and then, frankly, the UAE's success at COP, these are both signs of shifting winds. So what are your reflections on the year? And also, what did you pick up in Brazil?
Thank you, Mr. Ray. First of all, let me compliment you and NITI Aayog for organizing this international conference. And since I had actively participated in it, several inputs of this conference were used while drafting of the final New Delhi Leaders Declaration. And as all of you are aware, we've had a fairly ambitious and an action-oriented Delhi Declaration. It was also very inclusive because it focused on being a very strong advocate of the emerging markets, and that was necessary because if growth has to be accelerated, I think the important point to remember always is that G20 started off as a forum of the finance ministers and the central bank governors, and growth and development is its primary agenda. It's not geopolitics. Geopolitics came in much later last year because food, fuel and fertilizers started getting impacted. And therefore for us, driving growth was important. And to my mind, growth is slowed down. 1/3 of the world is facing a recession. Germany has also got into a technical recession right now. And therefore it's important that we accelerate the pace of global growth, because without growth, it'll be impossible to accelerate the pace of sustainable development goals. And therefore, our first priority was strong, sustainable, inclusive growth. And this requires that we push for global trade, because if you look at the history of pandemics, every time you've had a global pandemic for the next 5 to 6 years, you have protectionism. And the Inflation Reduction Act and the of America and the CHIPS Act are very classic case acts promoting protectionism, and actually the bastion of free trade is now pushing for protectionism in a very big way. So for us, it was important to advocate that you need free trade in a very big manner, and WTO, which to my mind today is almost a dead body, needs to be revitalized for global trade, because trade has lifted vast segments of population above the poverty line, and without trade it will be impossible to accelerate both growth and lifting people above the poverty line. Secondly, I think it's very important that SDG, which were only 12%, instead of progressing, the world has regressed. Only 12% of the 169 priorities are on target. We are able to accelerate the implementation of SDG. So we came out with an action plan for the next 7 years of SDG, which is an integral part of SDG, which is an integral part of our presidency. And third, there was a green development agenda, which talked about tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, the life mission, circular economy, many other things. It was a very comprehensive green development agenda. And fourthly, technology development and digital public infrastructure. But both SDG and climate green development agenda both require long-term financing. And therefore, multilateral institutions which were constituted in the post-World War II era, the post-Bretton Woods period, need to be revitalized, restructured, to be able to bring in blended finance, first loss guarantee, credit enhancement. Important point is that there's no shortage of funds. There are $300 trillion available in the world. Almost $150 trillion are available with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. But they need to be de-risked to enable them to flow to emerging markets. I'm making this point because this year almost 80% of the growth, global growth, is coming from emerging markets. And according to IMF, 2/3 of the growth in the next 2 decades will come from emerging markets. And therefore, institutions need to ensure that funds flow into emerging markets and not the other way around, as it's happening now, that funds are flowing from developing countries to developed world. And therefore, the international financial architecture and multilateral financial institutions are both weighed against the emerging markets. And therefore, restructuring them is very critical. And I think the last priority that we had, which is very important, was women-led development. Because if the world is going to comprise of 50% of the women, then improving their learning outcome, health outcomes, nutritional standards, all becomes very critical, and putting them into positions of authority is all very critical. That formed a priority. I've just returned from Brazil, and Brazil in its first meeting of the Sherpas has advocated 3 clear priorities, and one is inequality and elimination of poverty, and second is about pushing for green and sustainable growth, where
climate action, climate finance will play a critical role. And thirdly, reforming the global governance, global governance structure and reforming it is their third key priority. So broadly, these are the three key priorities on which we'll be working. But important to say that many of the issues which have emerged from New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, including the final recommendations of the Larry Summers Encasing report, many of these recommendations of the Leaders' Declaration need to be taken forward for implementation. So the challenge is that we take declarations forward for implementation and vigorously push them on ground for implementation. And I think that was the focus of discussion in the first Sherpa meeting. The nature of G20 is that leadership moves from one country to another. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. So every country starts picking up new priorities or giving a new name to the earlier priorities, but there is a lot of action has already been taken in the last few presidencies, which need to be where action and implementation on ground needs to be pushed very vigorously and in a very accelerated manner. And we are there to fully support, assist and collaborate with Brazil in both pursuing its own agenda, which it has laid out, as well as providing all support in implementation of what G20 has decided at New Delhi. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. Ambassador, first and foremost, a little late, but let me formally present to you for transmission to your Sherpa or your government this report. It was made to you. Second, though, Amitabh has already, so this is for you. Amitabh has already talked about, and indeed I was, President Lula, when he came to the G20, already then articulated Brazil's G20 goals. And I was privileged, as I was at the SDG summit of the General Assembly, to hear what President Lula, who traditionally opens the general debate at the UN, had to say about the, if you like, the inequities in the global order and why they have to be a focus of attention, quite apart from growth, but just in terms of fairness. But you have prepared remarks, but if you could also, given your vast experience at the WTO, in particular, give your perspective on what Sherpa had to say about the recovery of the WTO as a forum for revitalizing trade. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts with this distinguished audience. Good afternoon, Mr. Amitabh Kant, President Indian Sherpa. Thank you for being here. Just trying to elaborate on the question you have just posed. Well, as you know, the WTO has been suffering from some years now of not having a functional dispute settlement. And of course, dispute settlement throughout the first 10 or 15 years of the WTO had of course guaranteed the idea that trade conflicts or violations of trade commitments would be sorted out either through diplomatic means, if not through diplomatic means, through a very well designed dispute settlement process. This, of course, has in some cases the decisions made were considered by some countries as going farther than then the competence, so to speak, of the dispute settlement panelists or judges in the appellate body. That notwithstanding, Brazil has been a frequent user of the dispute settlement body, and in spite of the fact that in some cases also according to our perception, decisions were not what we thought they should be, based on the covered agreements, basically, for example, the subsidies agreement, which were the object of many disputes in which Brazil has taken part. But despite of that, we thought that this was very important to have a dispute settlement body, a functional one. So one of the key priorities of Brazil when it comes to our positions we defend in the WTO is to restore the dispute settlement body. And now connecting to the G20 process, which of course includes among its pillars a trade pillar, in the sense that it's a very important, as Mr. Sherpa has mentioned, the driver of growth, very important one. We think that that the lack of a functional dispute settlement body is affecting, is preventing us from having a very valuable instrument in times where we have been seeing a number of countries putting in place some measures, environmentally motivated measures, which in fact curtail trade, are barriers to trade, which we think in many cases are the way they are implemented, or the way we think they could be implemented, will be a form of disguised protectionism, and also will prevent developing countries from enjoying one of the basic channels to economic growth. If you see throughout history, export-led growth has been one of the key drivers of economic growth for developing countries to catch up historically. So this is a matter of real concern for Brazil. We think that at least when you see the political discourse of some countries saying, no, the measures we have been introducing are WTO compatible. Of course, this is a question. There is no functional dispute settlement body. So at the end of the day, at the end of the day, this is an open question. But what strikes me is the fact that when saying that this is WTO compatible, or supposedly WTO compatible, this political discourse does not say it's climate law compatible, in the sense that if you want to bring into trade law, into trade policy law, environmental concerns, you have also to bring into trade law also climate law principles. Basically, the first that comes to my mind is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So this is one of the. I think this has connects with one important aspect, or pillar of Brazilian G20 presidency, which is promoting social inclusion and in striving to promote social inclusion, addressing inequality as a form of extreme exclusion. So I'll stop here. Of course, this is a very vast subject.
We'll have time to come back. Kapil, firstly, thank you to IDRC for being our partner in this, and let me also thank you as a former head of NCAR, and my successor but one is in the room, for the generosity of the foundations, but channeled through IDRC, for the support that you gave to the think tank, IDRC gave to the think tank initiative. So you may have prepared remarks, but two things on which I think the audience would be interested to hear from you. One is, more broadly, how does IDRC support capacity building on this class of issues in the global south. And people may not know quite how unusual a creature IDRC is, in the sense that you are an instrument of the Canadian government to support socioeconomic research, as I understand it. But secondly, if you wouldn't mind sharing with this audience, as you did with me, really what you see as the opportunities and also the missed opportunities now that India is associated with bringing the African Union into the G20. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Suman. And let me start by saying it's been an absolute pleasure for IDRC to support the G20 initiative that was led by NITI. I'll address the issues that you mentioned, but I want to start and maybe put it in context and talk in terms of the shifting sands that you referred to in your remarks. Because I think we have a unique opportunity at this point in time for the role that the Global South can play in influencing the global development agenda. And we saw with the Indonesian presidency of the G20 last year, with India's presidency this year, Brazil next year, South Africa the year after that. This is an unprecedented sequence of events which I think really does present a very unique opportunity, and I think that the Global South should take advantage of that. At a time when the world is really going through a lot of changes, whether geopolitical, technological, climate-related, I think what we saw with India's G20 presidency, how a vocal member of the leading South can take some of these changes that are taking place and put it within a framework which actually makes the whole G20 process very democratic and inclusive. I think, I've been associated with the G20 for many years, and I have not seen a situation where a country went out and hosted so many events in so many different locations and involved so many people in subject matter which they might not have ordinarily been familiar with. So for us at IDRC, what was truly pleasurable to watch was the democratization, if you will, of the G20 agenda. And I think this is something that the world can really learn from. Absolutely. The other point that I would like to make is, you wanted my take. I spent a little over a decade previously working on Africa as part of a senior member of the African Development Bank. And I really heard a hunger, if you will, on the part of our colleagues in Africa to learn from the India experience. And it was not just about digital public infrastructure. It was about a range of issues like providing access to services for those who are most marginalized, or the financing of infrastructure. And I can go on about the number of areas that we spoke of. And what I realize is that India has this real depth of institutions, whether it is think tanks, and you mentioned that we had supported think tanks. A few years ago, we spent about $250 million supporting think tanks throughout the world, throughout the Global South, because we believe very strongly that it is critically important for countries to develop this capacity to analyze economic and social developments and to really present points of view which might not necessarily be traditionally coming from the global north. So, the think tank initiative was a very, very important initiative, but I think India has a wealth of these think tanks, has a wealth of community-based organizations, NGOs, universities, who can be central in transmitting this knowledge, not just to Africa, but in many parts of Asia as well. I'm fortunate enough to be the regional director for Asia, and in traveling to other parts of Asia, I've heard repeatedly this request that India needs to make its knowledge much more accessible. And I think we need to find ways in which we can actually do that, because not doing it, I think, is a wasted opportunity. And all I would like to put on the table is that this is something which is very, very dear to IDRC. We believe very strongly in supporting the Global South and in providing resources to institutions to make this happen. And therefore, going forward, let me just repeat once again, I think it's been a pleasure to work with you on this event, but I'm hopeful that this is the beginning of a longer relationship. And as I end, I would like to say that as far as Brazil is concerned, as I was talking to you, Ambassador, before this, we're also supporting Brazil in its efforts during its entire G20 presidency. And I really hope we can take this dialogue forward. So Suman, thanks very much for this.
Thanks, Kapil. So do I have the okay of my colleagues on the dais to go to Q&A now, and then based on, as it were, what comes back, we would have a discussion amongst ourselves. And I'm afraid I'm going to reverse the usual order. I'm going to, as it were, reach out to members of the audience to begin with. But let me start with my colleagues, the honorable members who are at the conference. Let me ask Dr. Chand, Dr. Paul, whether you would wish to initiate the discussion at any... Dr. Chand, anything about climate change in agriculture, for example? Mike here, please. Mike, Abdi. Mike?
Just a few issues other than those which are already included in this book. One is I want to congratulate UAE for bringing agriculture into discussion on climate change. For bringing agriculture into discussions on climate change. I think that is very, very important, because if we look at contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gas emission, in India, it is just same as share of agriculture in total GVA, but for the world average, the share of agriculture in greenhouse gases is quite disproportionate, many times more than what is its share in GVA. So that is one point which I want to make, that whenever we have discussion on green and sustainable growth agenda, to my mind, it is incomplete if we are not explicitly bringing agriculture into discussion. This second is that in the last 6-7 years, there is a perceptible increase in incidence of hunger. In fact, if I look at country of Ambassador, Brazil, it has reached the goal of zero hunger. Zero mean if it is below 2%, we treat it as zero hunger, but it is back into hunger. Hunger has emerged in Brazil. Same is the situation in most of the developing countries which are member of G20. And this quite trend of rise in hunger is happening despite the fact that per capita food production is rising. This is a very, very serious situation. To my mind, the reason is that food is becoming very, very costly. I think that also need to be brought on the agenda, because hunger, nutrition are very important. So how we make food affordable? By reducing cost of production. So these are the 2 points.
Thank you. Arunabha, I'll come to you a little bit on the methane issue and really what the fine print on that is, because I know you would know about it. But Dr. Paul, before I let you go, could you just educate the community? You and Sherpa would know what the reference to One Health was in the Leaders' Declaration. But for the rest of us, because no doubt you have been in the lead on this, can you clarify what the One Health concept is?
Thank you, sir. One Health concept emanates from the reality that humanity, animals, environment, we are all interconnected in terms of challenges to health, specifically coming from microorganisms and specifically from viral disorders. We have learned from the pandemic that diseases jump from one to the other, and we had serious consequences. climate change is going to exacerbate these trends as we move into future. So very aptly, the New Delhi Leaders Declaration has brought that sharp focus, which emerged out of detailed discussions at the health related health leadership of the G20 nations. It's a real focus, and India is responding to this in multiple ways, but also as a national One Health mission, and the details can be discussed later. Before I close, I want to thank the leadership of the G20 for putting a clear message on accelerating pace for SDGs. It's very coming at a very appropriate time. For India, achieving SDGs is a milestone on the path to Viksit Bharat. So thank you for doing it. Thank you.
Back to you, Amitabh. Arunabha, sorry. Implicit in what Dr. Chand said, and I'm not sure which side of this India was officially, there are various kinds of methane, including agricultural methane. So can you just unpack what was agreed on methane and whether, in fact, bringing agriculture into the climate change discussion is in India's interest and the globe's interest? How do you see it?
First of all,
and thank you for participating in the conference itself.
Thank you for inviting me, and many congratulations to NITI and, of course, to IDRC and GDN for organizing this conference and this follow-up meeting. On the methane issue, for those who are not deep into the molecule, methane is more than 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and that's why even this decade we will have a bulk, not a majority of, but a bulk of the warming that will happen this decade will be attributed to methane. That's why last year there was a great global methane pledge that was announced, and this year again several large oil and gas companies came forward to announce that they would substantially eliminate methane, at least methane leakages from their operations by about, I think, 2035. But I think then to the point that you're raising, Ms. Berry, there is agricultural methane and then there is oil and gas methane. And I think this also goes back to this CBDR issue that Ambassador brought up, because the Commonwealth differentiated responsibility, because I think eliminating and methane leakages from oil and gas operations is very different from a technology point of view, but also from an obligation and responsibility point of view, compared to looking at dealing with methane from agricultural emissions, whether it is livestock or farming itself. That does not mean that we should not be thinking about sustainable agriculture. And this is to Dr. Chand's point. There are many ways to think about sustainable agriculture that goes beyond methane. I think this is where a lot of the initiatives that India itself is taking, whether in promoting agroforestry, natural farming, soil conservation, there's more carbon that's retained in soil than in the atmosphere. So none of this is actually linked to methane alone. So we can actually push for a global south narrative around sustainable agriculture, which is in part linked to, but still distinct from, a very politicized methane-related conversation. But while I have the mic, may I make two quick points to the issues that were brought up. I think even between when the meeting was held in July and the G20 Leaders Summit in September, and now 6 months later in December, what has changed? One of the things that has changed is that the issues of industrial policy that Mr. Kant also brought up are becoming even more apparent now. Just yesterday, or was the day before, the United Kingdom has now announced that they will introduce carbon pricing at the border. Now with the dysfunctional WTO dispute settlement mechanism, what might be or might not be WTO compatible, we will never know. But as Ambassador said, it's still not necessarily climate compatible, at least by virtue of the agreements we've signed up to. Now what worries me is in 2024, there are 70 countries that are going into elections, which means that there is a potential that even as we drive towards a more green, sustainable agenda, the potential to use domestically favorable industrial policy that tendency might actually increase, which would create these regulatory islands that we need to make sure that we combat and create a more interdependent, interlinked, resilient, and reliable supply chain of clean energy products and services. Otherwise, we'll build a global economy that is greener, but the global south will still remain far behind the curve. Exactly at a moment where they both need to green up their economies, but also are the regions where the sun shines the most. So the clean infrastructure and the clean manufacturing is better positioned in the global south, exactly when we are building these artificial walls against them.
Thanks. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to finance briefly. So we have Deepak in the room who can talk a little bit on how the discussion has moved since July on MDB reform, and maybe Poonam a little bit on reform. First, Deepak, please. Yeah, and then Poonam on the global monetary order, and then Montague, if you care to, you also specifically on the issue of from an Indian point of view, how should we be thinking of financing our own green transition? But Deepak, from a global point of view?
Thank you, Suna, for inviting me. I was actually, I did not participate in the conference because I was away, but thanks for doing this conference. It seems like it's turned out very well. I'll just briefly talk about some of the financing issues that you mentioned, and I think Sherpa mentioned about the MDB reform that Mr. Singh and Larry Summers were part of it. So one of the things this work that we had done was we said that MDBs, as it came out in your conference, are pretty central to the green agenda and some of the global challenges that the world is facing. And the report, we talked about three things: tripling the financing capacity of the MDBs, tripling the mandate from twin goals to third goals, which is adding about global challenges and transboundary issues. And the third was to create a third mechanism through which financing can go, which is about private sector funding of the MDBs. These reports have been very well received. So in Marrakesh, in the fourth finance minister and central bank governors, the reports were endorsed and a lot of the ideas were focused. The MDB heads have actually accepted this idea. This is actually a terrific contribution of India G20 presidency to the world. And now the MDBs are actually discussing in the respective boards about how some of these ideas are going to be implemented. If you actually hear Mr. Banga, wherever he goes, he talks about many things where he invokes the recommendation of this report that came out of the Indian presidency. So I feel in this idea of the green and sustainable growth agenda and the MDB reforms are very complementary to each other. So this is a terrific contribution of India's presidency to the world. Thank you so much.
Poonam, I had thought, I don't know if I've written it, that Brazil is quite a different economy from India financially. It's got a lower savings rate, it's much more integrated into global capital markets, and has very, very sophisticated, a very sophisticated financial system. So I'm hoping that the other shoe that was to fall, which is international monetary reform, might be something that Brazil could embrace because frankly it has more capacity and fewer hang-ups than we do. How would you advise the Brazilians in this area?
Brazil has been a very interesting economy, an economy that I have studied along with the other large emerging markets as a part of my research work. But Brazil and India also differ to the extent that Brazil opened up its capital accounts much sooner, and they started imposing or using capital account flow measures later, having opened up a great deal early on. But let me take this issue or question in a slightly broader sense. When India started its G20 presidency, the global economic situation was much more precarious. War had just broke out a few months after India took over the presidency. Inflation in advanced economies had started to rise up. A tightening cycle had started, and things were looking a little bit more risky as far as the global economy was concerned. Now, during the last year, things have panned out much better in many respects. Advanced economy inflation rates have peaked. They are inching towards 3% now. Monetary policy has peaked. Oil prices have stabilized. Global growth outlook, at least for this year, has been upgraded. So what is it that Brazil may encounter as far as the situation is concerned on the global economy side? One issue that continues to remain important is the debt situations, public debt situations around the world, which remains elevated. Now, the progress that was made during 2023 India's presidency was that no overt debt crisis happened around the world, except for a handful. But low-income countries remain debt distress. That discussion needs to be taken forward. Emerging markets have very little space left fiscally to either promote their economies fiscally or to make the green transition. That question will remain important. And advanced economies are sitting on a very big debt levels. So I think those will remain important. Issues related to spillovers, I think we saw the worst already, will not be as important during your presidency. And I guess growth will remain a challenge given how constrained economies are fiscally. So I think that's something you may want to look into.
Monty, if I could turn to you, you have recently been thinking a lot about both the mechanism of progress on climate change, but also climate finance. But it is the case that as far back as 2009, you represented India as Sherpa at the London summit, which was in many ways a kind of high water mark. And there was a lot of discussion there of monetary reform. Not much has happened. So on either or both of these topics, any observations you'd like to share?
Thanks, Bhupender. You said I've been thinking. I'm still thinking. So I actually came largely to hear. But since I'm not commenting on monetary reform, it's too complicated, and I think Poonam is better placed to advise on that. I just want to highlight one thing, which I think is pretty clear from the technical inputs that have gone into both the G20 and the COP, and are not, in my view, reflected in anyone's general realization. Whether you look at the Singh-Summers report or you look at the Nick Stern-Songwe report, which was submitted to the G20, I mean, the big number that comes out is that the additional investment that's needed is very large. Annual numbers of whatever, sometimes they say 3-point-something trillion, sometimes 5 trillion. Both reports are very, very clear about one thing. That is that something of the order of 2/3 of this has to be mobilized domestically. Now, if you juxtapose that with what Poonam said, that the developing countries don't have the capacity to do anything, then we need to ask the question, I mean, are we conducting the discussion by telling both of these committees that we reject this proposition? I haven't heard anyone say that. If you accept the proposition, then the developing countries have to be asked the question, what are you going to do about all this? And I've not seen that discussed. I've not seen that raised. I looked for suggestions in Dubai, which might suggest it's been highlighted. It's not been highlighted. Now, let's look at what these reports say about international finance. One thing is very clear. The scale of international finance required, even by them, this is after the assumption that developing countries are going to do a lot. The scale of international finance, coming to about maybe something of the order of $1 trillion per year. And then they say, well, half of that is going to come from the FDIs in the private sector, and maybe the other half can come from bilateral and multilateral. Now, when you have these discussions, I think it's useful to recognize governments cannot negotiate what the private sector will do. That is just a hope. Governments can negotiate what they're going to do. Nor can we ask developed countries for private sector flows. If you want to attract them, you have to find out what will attract private sector flows. So I hope that this is all going to come up in the COP of 2025. Until then, we are stuck with this 100 billion figure, which we haven't yet received. The first and most important point is that this 100 billion is an utter absurdity. It's a separate matter that the world hasn't delivered it. The 100 billion, as those of you who've been following this know, was invented out of a hat in 2009 in Copenhagen, because you wanted to persuade that, look, you developing countries better do something. But up till then, developing countries weren't willing to accept any obligation. So they said, well, developing countries will take on obligations about reducing, if you like, the emissions intensity of GDP, and the developed countries will agree to 100 billion. And that 100 billion was public and private, and nobody knew what the definition of public and private, etc. was going to be. Now this sneaked into the Paris Agreement, because at that time, the only commitment by developing countries related to emissions intensity. Now, the world was rewritten in 2021 when the developing countries undertook to actually get to net zero by different dates. 2050 for many, 2060 for China and a couple of others, 2070 for India. Now, the order of responsibility that developing countries took on by saying, look, we're not just going to reduce emissions intensity, we're going to go down to zero, is huge. And that 100 billion was just pulled out of a hat. I really don't understand why anybody bothers about it. I think the best thing is for the world to say, we have no idea whether you're going to deliver 100 billion or not by 2024. The real name of the game is, what are you going to offer in 2025? And COP28 is singularly silent on that, very wisely. It says that the 6th meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, which will take place in 2025, will discuss what we should do. So frankly, I think any notion that we have reached any kind of agreement on what the world is going to do beyond the 100 billion needs to be revised. At the moment, we have no indication at all.
But the flip side of that is that a large emerging market like India had better think about the 2/3 that's coming domestically.
Absolutely right. And when you look at that, one of the critical things, which again, I don't think that the COP28 did very much on, is issues of energy pricing, issues of carbon taxation, issues of emissions trading, all of which are floating around in our thinking and in different parts of the pipeline. But that's really what's going to be important.
I'd like to go to the diplomats in just a minute, but Arnab, was there any progress on Article 6? Was there much discussion?
Very little progress there, very little progress on defining climate finance, what is public, what is private. So effectively what is happening is we are constantly using COPs to raise ambition without thinking of what is called the means of implementation.
Could you explain Prime Minister Modi's green credit, how that differed from, or what's the innovation there?
So this is something, of course, that India has introduced itself in October, the green credit scheme, and then Prime Minister Modi talked about the green credit initiative, which is not just linked to carbon, it's actually linked to biodiversity, to water, etc., so that you can have credits being issued for credible projects that are undertaken. India itself is bilaterally negotiating Article 6.2 agreements with several other countries, for instance, on trading of green hydrogen and so forth. But at the end of the day, unless we create an architecture that monitors, reviews, verifies, these credits and the value, at least the credibility of it is the same everywhere else, then only we will be able to create a genuinely interoperable market. But this is not a substitute for some version of carbon pricing that is introduced. Now in India there is a lot of implicit carbon pricing. Whether other countries will recognize that implicit carbon pricing or not remains open, especially when unilateral measures are taken. So the point is, corps have to start unblocking these bottlenecks. Otherwise, each country will start coming up with their own definitions of what is green hydrogen, what is a green credit, what is carbon pricing. And you will have a morass of, just like with trade agreements, you'll have a spaghetti bowl of definitions rather than actual flow of finance.
Okay, I have to come back to the panel, but we have all recognized that geopolitics is lurking in the background. We have ambassadors here, but is Colm Carpenter still here or has he left? I think. Sanjeev, you were a speaker there. Any? Yes, I'll come. I just wanted to acknowledge anything you want to add here. I think there was one of your colleagues, but he may have left. Okay, let's open it up, please, sir. You wanted to speak? Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Sir, myself Amitabh Kant. I am a faculty in V.V. Giri National Labour Institute, Noida. So I would like to that Mr. Kant has rightly highlighted we are world over 50% of women are to be there. Also in the workforce also, though in Indian context the labor force participation was going down, but it has again picked up. And the health outcome, nutrition outcome. In this context, I would like to place here that the out-of-pocket expenditure is high still in Indian context, especially in women's context. And the last week I was the part of ILO's presentation, Brazil-India Inter-Regional South-South Cooperation, Inter-Regional South-South Cooperation, where it was, the Brazilian presentation was that women are paying highest taxes, both direct and indirect taxes, in terms of health and sanitary product stuffs, and also capital gain point of view. And so also in Indian context also, we see that. Yes, I am concluding that, sir, our multilateral also Indian approach should be how to reduce and finance the out-of-pocket expenditure, so that for inclusive and inclusive development, we need our women to be flag bearer.
I'll take that as a comment because I've been so anti-democratic. Charan, I'll just take questions and then go back to the panel. Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity. I've been listening to this climate risk for a very long time. I am Dr. Charan Singh. I chair a public sector bank, which is Punjab and Sindh Bank. I've also been an RBHA professor at IIM Bangalore. While all this discussion that we have been listening for the last 1 year specifically and for nearly 2 decades now, totally agree with what Montek sir said, 100 billion came out of a hat. I've been also struggling similarly with the Maastricht Treaty targets of 3% and 60% debt to GDP ratio, which gets imposed on the emerging countries and never on the advanced countries. Now my quick question is, sir, while $100 billion we are all waiting, I am worried in the country itself, what is the impact of a 1 degree change on my bank's portfolio? In our country, while we may keep waiting for the 100 billion, which may come, may not come, and will certainly to me may not come at all, what is the preparation that we countries individually are doing for this climate change and this financial sector balance sheets of the banks? We as an emerging country, I feel, need to take lead in that. Thank you.
Earlier, there was somebody here from NDMA, but I don't know. I think let's make this an offline conversation. Go back to the panel. The point being that there are now methodologies, as I understand it, being piloted by CDRI and NDMA on at least assessing risks to infrastructure. Break in Sikkim has revealed that that even insured public assets don't necessarily get full payment. Perhaps, particularly since you have to leave, Sherpa, could I ask you just to react to what you've heard? It seems as though, and I can testify to this, that India has gained a great deal of credit for its boldness and its success. So other than a victory lap, what is it that you would urge your former institution, NITI, the intellectual community in India, to be thinking about to take this forward?
So, I really think that while we were able to achieve in a very fractured world a lot of consensus in G20 on climate action and climate finance, a lot needs to be done. And that should be, there the leadership must be taken by NITI Aayog because it cuts across, it's a multi-dimensional area. Two areas where ministerials actually let us down, and let me be honest about it, were both on the climate side and on the energy side. And we had 6 paras which remained incomplete in the energy side and 5 paras which had remained incomplete in the climate side at the ministerial levels. And finally it was left to the Sherpas to find a consensus on both those areas. And that was because, simply because many of these areas, there's lack of adequate knowledge and there's lack of adequate technical skill which should be brought forth by NITI Aayog, to my mind. And leadership on climate action, because today the G7 is talking about saying that this year they will achieve 100 billion which they had committed to, they will achieve based on some OECD study, which is all greenwashing, complete greenwashing. Nobody from India is contesting that. And on the finance side, rightly Mr. Ahluwalia has pointed out, very little has been achieved in COP28. COP28, to my mind, has been an utter failure as far as Global South is concerned. Finance, there's not a word movement forward. And all of us, all that is talked about there is the use of the word fossil fuel without spelling out very clearly what the transition will be and how the finance will come in. Today in the world, if you look at it, 1% of the corporates account for 40% of the greenhouse gas emission. And none of these companies are being taken to task. No outcomes are being brought out. Stock markets are not punishing them. They should be punished in the marketplace. None of it is being put out into the marketplace. And I think a very detailed, intensive study needs to be done by NITI Aayog on this climate finance area. This is a very critical area for us. This will become the key issue in Brazil during Brazil's presidency. And we must have all the intellectual bandwidth of all emerging markets and developing countries.
Well, I mean, whether NITI has the internal capacity is less the issue than it certainly has the convening capacity, and that's what you are. And that can be a basis for
not only convening capacity, but internal capacity. You need to do a vast amount of modeling
Ambassador. So, having had the privilege of working on your country, you need to leave. Well, thank you very much. A hand to Amitabh for both joining now and for his achievement. Thank you, Amitabh. You've seen the nature of public debate. It was my impression, having worked on Brazil, that Brazil has an even more sophisticated domestic political debate. But do you wish to react to any of what you have heard?
Yes, there have been so many mentions to Brazil and in a number of areas. Just starting with agriculture. First, regarding the comment that agriculture now has been part of COP28, Brazil thinks it was a very good move for a number of reasons. The first is that when you really bring encompass agriculture into the discussion of climate change, you cut to size the real impact of agriculture in terms of climate change. I'm not denying the methane factor, and I mention it later. But in fact is that the vast majority of global emissions come from energy production and using. So this is the first point, because we have seen as Brazil a big agribusiness producer, having seen narratives basically almost giving the impression that the main culprit for climate change is agriculture. So I think that this will stimulate a more concrete discussion, and let's face the problems, the issues. I speak for Brazil. I'm not aware of the context in other countries, but for example, in Brazil, more than 70% of our emissions come from what you call land use. Either deforestation or not necessarily deforestation of primeval forests, fires in connection with old agriculture practices, and also from methane because of cattle and degraded lands. What we have committed, being a very big agribusiness producer and willing to, even out of enlightened self-interest, if you like, willing to remain in the business, but also help being part of the solution. Brazil has adopted some concrete steps in order to try to reduce methane emissions. The first is research into animal feed, because depending on animal feed, you have less or more or less methane emissions. And the second is more of a low-hanging fruit, if I may say, which is reducing methane emissions of degraded land. Brazil has an enormous extension of degraded land resulting from past deforestation, and these deforested lands were used for cattle feed, and then these lands were exhausted in terms of offering feed for cattle, natural feed for cattle, and then laying idle, they emit methane. At least I'm not a specialist in that, but I've been trying to be briefed on that. So Brazil has launched a big campaign to convert these idle lands or degraded lands into productive land. I think this will lead to a reduction of our national methane emissions, also combined with the reduction of emissions by cattle, as I have mentioned. And the third is the reduction of deforestation, which has been reduced by, I think, 60% from January to August since President Lula took office. So basically, this is what you are, and returning to this point, we are happy that agriculture is now part of COPs. Regarding food security, I think was also mentioned, and being Brazil a big producer, Brazilian agribusiness, of course, wants to make money, no doubt about this. But I think it has been having also let's face it, under pressure from our government, also international pressure to be part of the solution. That is why not only Brazilian government has been providing offering cooperation and partnership in order to boost productivity in developing countries. Not only trying to export, trying to share technology, and we have been in fact doing this for many years. But now we are intensifying this. I think one good example in point is Brazil has one of the highest milk productivity per cow in the world. Brazil is trying to share, so to speak, the secret of this very high milk productivity. This is just an example. Regarding finance, just a quick comment, because then I will spend here the rest of the afternoon making comments. But this is why Brazil has proposes to have a better coordination between the Sherpa track and the financial track, in the idea that the political discourse and good solutions found as a result of political discussions can be translated into financial action, in the sense of pursuing reform of international multilateral financial architecture, and in this context trying to find creative ways to reduce indebtedness, but without blocking financial flows, resource flows to the developing world. So this is just picked some points raised, but I would be more than happy to elaborate more on
well,
this.
I believe there's Haiti outside, and maybe some of the conversation can continue. In the absence of CEO, perhaps I could call on Urvashi to deliver the vote of thanks, but let me use this moment myself to thank her and others in the of the NITI staff. Kapil, any reactions to the discussion so far?
Well, recognizing it's 4 o'clock and you want to end, I've taken a lot of notes, and there were a lot of suggestions for the need for further analytical work, study, research, etc. I just want to put in a plug. We are a research financing organization. Green, sustainable growth is at the heart of what we do. So I hope we can engage going forward in providing some solutions to some of the issues that have been raised by financing some solid research in these areas. So I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. And for me, it was, I think, very good that we had this closure, because 6 months or 5 months is quite a long time. A lot has indeed happened. But my important takeaways were firstly agriculture, and I thank Dr. Chand for putting that on the issue, on the agenda. And secondly, the points that Montague, who's left, made about really we are operating really at the level of wish lists in terms of finance. And though Ajay Seth was here for the first session, and NITI will work closely with the finance ministry, if so requested, to follow through on the important work that Deepak Mishra mentioned on the Summers Singh report. So let me thank my colleagues and hand over to Urvashi for the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, sir, for moderating this insightful and also very interactive panel discussion. And thank you to the Brazilian ambassador and Dr. Kapil Kapoor for staying with us for the entire duration. As sir mentioned, the CEO had to leave early, but essentially we wanted to just say that we will continue to work on a lot of the insights that came out from the deliberations during the conference and have been outlined in the report. And as Sherpa mentioned, many of those found their way into the New Delhi Leaders Declaration as well. So thank you very much to the audience here, the guests who have joined us, esteemed guests from various think tanks, multilateral organizations, and for spending 2 hours with us this afternoon. We hope the discussions were interesting for you, and you will find the report interesting as well. Thank you very much.